Every time thunder roared outside, he smashed the sewer pipe forcefully, because only this way could he mask the loud noise and avoid being heard by the guards above. This thick pipe was his only path to escape. After more than 10 attempts, he finally managed to break it open. Sewage immediately gushed out, though the smell was nauseating. Andy climbed in without hesitation, even though the stench inside made him vomit continuously. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, rapidly crawling toward the dawn of freedom. After all, he had spent nearly 20 years preparing for this escape. Time quickly moved to the next morning. During the roll call, the guards noticed the prisoner from cell 245 never appeared. Sensing something wrong, they hurried to check on him, but the scene in front of their eyes left them stunned. Immediately, the red alarm rang out across the sky. When the warden heard this deadly alarm, he was leisurely changing his shoes, but in the next second, he rushed to the cell as if his pants were on fire. Looking at the tightly sealed small space, he couldn't understand how a living person had vanished into thin air. Suddenly, he remembered Andy's best friend, Red. The two were always sticking together. They must have plotted this prison break together. But when Red was called in, he looked completely confused, frustrated and furious. The warden started yelling and cursing, as if still not satisfied. He grabbed a small rock from the windowsill and angrily threw it at the beautiful woman poster on the wall. Unexpectedly, a strange echo sounded. When he stepped closer, he suddenly noticed the poster had a small hole in it. Feeling something wrong, he quickly tore the poster open. A huge hole instantly appeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone was shocked by the sight. No one could imagine how weak-looking Andy managed to quietly dig such a large hole under tight security. Such an amazing person as Andy. Why was he imprisoned for 20 years? Everything started on a night 20 years ago. Andy discovered that his wife was cheating on him. That night, he planned to use a gun to kill his wife and her lover. But Andy had never killed anyone, so he had to get himself completely drunk before daring to pick up the gun. Eventually, with the remaining trace of reason, he gave up this idea and threw the gun into the river. However, that very night, his wife and her lover were still shot dead. Because Andy had a strong motive for murder, he was immediately brought to court, since the gun he discarded wasn't recovered, and the bullets used by the killer matched the caliber of Andy's missing gun. He was declared guilty, ultimately sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. This is how Andy was wrongfully sent to Shawshank Prison. People familiar with prisons all knew. Older inmates were not friendly to newcomers. They would even secretly place bets on which coward would wet his pants first. Red, an experienced inmate, didn't think skinny and weak Andy had any chance, so he confidently decided to bet big. Damn cigarettes. That's a rich bet. However, Andy knew nothing about this bet. Even if he knew, he had no time to care, because he was terrified by the cruelty of the warden. A newcomer merely asked politely when they could go to the toilet during the warden's speech, but he was immediately kicked harshly in the stomach as punishment after experiencing mental torment. Andy then endured physical torture. Only after his body was cleaned and covered in powder was he allowed to walk naked into the tiny cell where he would spend decades. The first night in prison was always the hardest for newcomers, because the unfamiliar enclosed environment made them extremely vulnerable. But for seasoned inmates, it was a perfect opportunity to win bets. After the guards left, they deliberately pressured the bet targets. Eventually, a fat prisoner couldn't withstand the pressure and became the first one to cry and wet his pants. At first, the winners happily bragged about it, but the fat man's crying soon attracted the guards. Unable to tolerate his cries in the middle of the night, the guards dragged him out and beat him relentlessly until he lay motionless on the ground. Only then was he sent to the infirmary, but by the time he arrived, the doctor had already left, so the fat man was left lying there until morning. By the time the doctor returned, it was already too late. The inmates who scared him were stunned upon hearing this news. Others also showed sorrowful expressions, but after a brief moment of sadness, everyone went back to eating breakfast, as if a sudden death was nothing special in Shawshank Prison. Over the next month, life in prison returned to normal. Andy also kept to himself and rarely interacted with others, until one day, bored with prison life, Andy wanted a rock hammer to carve stones he picked up. So he took the initiative to approach Red, who could get anything inside. At first, Red suspected Andy planned to use the rock hammer to dig a tunnel, but when he saw how small the hammer was, he immediately dismissed the thought. After all, digging a tunnel with a hammer the size of a finger would take at least 600 years. After going through strict exchanges, the hammer finally reached Andy's hands. But peaceful days didn't last long. Andy soon encountered major trouble. The reason was a man in prison took a liking to him. The man repeatedly tried to make advances in the shower, but Andy coldly ignored him every time. One day, The man summoned two others known as the sisters and cornered Andy in a storeroom, intending to violently subdue him, despite Andy's fierce resistance. He was ultimately humiliated. Not only that, over the next 2 years, he constantly suffered harassment from the sisters. His face was often covered with injuries, just when he thought he couldn't hold on anymore. Fate offered him a turning point. One day, the warden needed 12 inmates to renovate the roof, because it was a special good job. Red quickly used his connections to bring out his friends, including Andy. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Andy not only temporarily escaped the sisters' torment, but also secured a good position for his future. It happened on the last day of roof repairs. Andy overheard the guard captain saying he inherited money from his brother, but due to high American inheritance taxes, he wouldn't have much left, which frustrated him greatly as a former bank vice president. Andy knew exactly how to legally avoid taxes, so he bravely stepped forward and offered his help. At first, the captain thought Andy was provoking him and angrily pushed him to the edge of the roof. This terrified the other inmates. But when Andy calmly explained his tax-saving solution, the captain quickly softened. Eventually, they reached an agreement. Andy handled all tax matters for the captain. In return, the captain bought cold beers for the 11 inmates. As the sun set, everyone enjoyed their drinks joyfully. At that moment, they felt like ordinary laborers, enjoying a peaceful afternoon after a day's work. This was exactly what Andy wanted to see. He wished everyone could live normally like those outside, so he could glimpse freedom through their eyes. But this freedom only lasted a few minutes, because once back in the cells, reality returned, and reality always tormented Andy relentlessly. After a period of silence, the lonely sisters once again found Andy, this time facing humiliation. Andy didn't stay silent. He chose to resist fiercely once more, but 2 fists couldn't win against 6 hands. Soon Andy was beaten half to death, finally sent to the infirmary, where he had to stay for a month. Fortunately, the leader of the sisters also paid the price. He was first locked in solitary confinement for a week, then brutally beaten by the guard captain after his release. Since the captain was notoriously ruthless, the leader was severely injured, eventually transferred to a hospital for disabled inmates, forced to eat through a straw for the rest of his life. Andy thought nobody would dare trouble him again after this example. But unexpectedly, right after he recovered and returned to his cell, he faced a surprise inspection. Watching his tiny cell turned upside down, Andy's heart nearly jumped out of his chest, because he still secretly kept the rock hammer. If discovered, the consequences would be unimaginable. Andy stood still, heart pounding like thunder. Suddenly, the warden asked him to turn around, then took away the Bible in his hand, but wanting to show off his knowledge of scripture. The warden didn't open the book, instead recited a passage from memory. When Andy responded fluently, the warden smiled instantly, slightly lowering his guard. But at this moment, he noticed the poster of a beautiful woman on the wall. Andy had asked Red to get this poster for him after watching a movie. Originally, prison rules prohibited posters. He decided not to make an issue of it. Before leaving, the warden handed the Bible back to Andy, saying the path of salvation lies within. Yes, sir, it turned out. News of Andy helping the captain avoid taxes had long reached the warden. Knowing Andy had extraordinary skills, the corrupt warden had instructed the captain to deal with the sisters, doing Andy a favor. This surprise inspection was to test if Andy posed a threat. After confirming Andy was just a puppet easy to control, the warden transferred him to the prison library to work alongside Brooks, the oldest inmate, on the surface. This seemed like a leisurely clerical job, but actually, the library was just a front. Andy's real duty was to provide free financial consulting for the guards. Because Andy worked quickly and efficiently, his reputation soon spread throughout the prison. Even the cautious warden also got involved. As Andy's workload increased, Red became his assistant. Andy spent 6 busy years this way. During this time, he wanted everyone to have access to more books, so he asked the warden to approve funding for new ones. After being refused, he began writing weekly letters to the state senate requesting funds to expand the library. Unfortunately, every letter vanished without reply, but Andy never gave up. One day, when he returned to the library after sending another letter, he saw Brooks threatening an inmate with a knife. Although unsure of the reason, Andy patiently calmed Brooks down. It turned out Brooks had been granted parole. Normally good news, but Brooks had lived in prison for 50 years, already accustomed to everything here. He didn't want to leave at all. He hoped committing a crime would allow him to stay longer. Andy couldn't understand Brooks' behavior. Red explained that Brooks had been institutionalized. In prison, Brooks had status and a job. Once outside, he was just an old man with arthritis. Cruel as it sounded, that was the truth. After releasing the crow he raised for years, Brooks staggered out of prison, toward freedom, but the free world frightened him. He feared riding the unfamiliar bus, feared busy streets filled with traffic, severely disconnected from society, even though the government arranged a place to live, and found him an easy supermarket job. He still couldn't fully integrate. Often discriminated against due to his age, already uncomfortable in this world. Being rejected made him feel even lonelier. Once he even considered killing the supermarket manager to return to prison, but he knew his old bones couldn't do it. So one day, he put on his suit, took out a small knife, carved Brooks was here on the beam, then satisfied, he kicked away the chair beneath him. When inmates heard this news, they couldn't shake off the sorrow for a long time. Fortunately, after tragedy came good news. One day, the prison suddenly received a large pile of old books and $200 cash. It turned out the Senate finally got fed up with Andy's weekly letters over the past 6 years. They tried to get rid of him this way. Andy immediately responded by saying, "It seems I'll have to write 2 letters per week from now on," hoping for even more funding. While sorting through the old books, he found a record. When the guard stepped out briefly, Andy played it in the broadcast room. Initially, he just wanted to enjoy it himself, but the next second, he locked the door and turned on the microphone. The beautiful melody echoed throughout every corner of the prison. All inmates stopped working, quietly listening to the touching music. In that moment, the prison walls seemed to vanish. Everyone seemed free again. Andy sat comfortably on the chair, enjoying the song, just like when he quietly watched his friends drink beer. The furious warden ordered Andy to stop immediately, but Andy ignored him completely, even defiantly turning the volume up. Showing off was momentarily satisfying, but punishment quickly followed. Andy was thrown into solitary confinement for 2 weeks. Afterward, he proudly told his friends, "Music fills the soul with hope." For that hope, he willingly endured punishment. But Red solemnly replied, "I once played harmonica too, but I quit long ago, because to me, any hobby or hope inside prison is meaningless, even dangerous." The reason Red was so pessimistic was that for nearly 30 years, he had actively applied for parole, each time sincerely expressing remorse, promising never to threaten society again. But every time, he was heartlessly rejected. So he advised Andy based on experience, to compromise with reality. Otherwise, the greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. Yet Andy later gave Red a harmonica, firmly telling him, "Hope is like music in your mind. Nobody and nothing can take it away." Soon after, hope truly arrived at the prison, due to Andy's persistent letters. The Senate realized $200 wasn't enough, so they agreed to provide $500 annually to build the prison library. Moreover, Andy contacted charitable organizations, buying used books by weight. Under his passionate leadership, the old library transformed into New England's best prison library. Yet during that same year, the warden introduced a new policy. The goal of this policy was to send prisoners outside as free labor. Many businessmen secretly bribed the warden to secure these cheap resources, though clearly illegal. Andy skillfully laundered this money under the warden's instructions. Moreover, he took advantage of loopholes, creating a fictional person who existed only on paper. All the laundered money went straight into this imaginary person's bank account. Even if things went wrong later, nobody could trace it back to him. When Red heard about this, he praised Andy as a genius. Not long after, a group of new inmates arrived. Among them, the most memorable to Andy was Tommy, sentenced to 2 years for breaking and entering. Tommy's sudden appearance completely changed Andy's fate. With a charming personality and positive attitude, Tommy quickly became popular. Andy encouraged him to improve himself while he was still young, motivated by his wife and child at home. Tommy was determined to change. After learning Andy had helped many others, Tommy approached him for help. He wanted a high school diploma, so he could find proper work after release. But Tommy had been on the streets since childhood. He couldn't even recognize letters. Andy patiently taught him from scratch. 1 year later, Tommy faced his high school diploma exam inside the prison. Andy supervised the exam. During the test, Tommy was nervous and restless. When Andy announced the end, Tommy angrily crumpled his paper and threw it in the trash. Believing he had failed, Andy understood Tommy's anxiety and his deep desire for a new life. So after Tommy stormed out, Andy quietly picked up the crumpled exam paper and sent it to the education board. Tommy soon regretted his outburst. He didn't want to disappoint Andy, nor direct his frustration at the person who helped him. He approached Red to talk. During their conversation, Andy's case came up. Tommy's face immediately turned serious after hearing it. He quickly went to Andy and shared a story that deeply shocked him. 4 years ago, while Tommy was serving time in another prison, He met a prisoner convicted of robbery. This prisoner often bragged about his crimes. One time he claimed he had killed a cheating couple, but the husband, a banker, was framed for the murders. Hearing this, Andy couldn't remain calm. Previously, he even wondered if he'd committed the crime while drunk, but now it was clear he was innocent. Andy immediately went to the warden, hoping to clear his name, but the warden's reaction was dismissive and indifferent. He claimed finding that inmate was impossible. Actually, he just wanted to keep Andy around, to avoid the exposure of his money laundering scheme. Andy sensed the warden's concerns and assured him he'd keep quiet. But instead of gaining trust, he was thrown into solitary confinement for a month. Red felt anger and frustration after hearing this, but all he could do was repeatedly tell others Andy was innocent. Around this time, Tommy received a letter. It was his exam result. He had passed. When Andy heard this news, he smiled faintly, genuinely happy for Tommy. But that very night, Tommy was summoned by the warden to a secluded area near the prison's back entrance. At first, the warden politely offered Tommy a cigarette, then asked if his story about Andy was true, if he would testify in court. Tommy quickly agreed, but suddenly the warden's face turned cold. He signaled a guard on the watchtower. Gunshots rang out. Tommy collapsed dead on the spot. Tommy only had 1 year left in prison. He could have restarted his life soon. Instead, his life was mercilessly taken away. The official explanation was attempted escape. Everyone knew the truth. But in Shawshank, the warden was law and justice. Nobody dared oppose him. Andy, even more so, was completely at his mercy. The warden killed Tommy just to control Andy completely. When Andy showed reluctance to continue money laundering, the warden threatened him relentlessly. Andy had no choice but to compromise. Yet after his solitary confinement ended, "I want to go to a town called Zihuatanejo, next to the Pacific Ocean, a place without memories. I'd open a hotel, buy an old boat to take guests fishing. When you're released, you can come find me there." Red thought Andy was daydreaming, but Andy replied, "Life comes down to two choices. Get busy living or get busy dying." Then, Andy looked at Red seriously. "When you're released on parole, go to a stone wall near a big oak tree. Underneath a black volcanic glass stone, you'll find something I've left for you." Red curiously asked what it was. Andy didn't answer. He turned around and left. Andy's unusual behavior worried Red. Soon after, another inmate told Red Andy had asked for a 6-foot rope, long enough to commit suicide. Thinking this, Red became deeply anxious, unable to sleep all night. By the next morning, he realized Andy wasn't planning suicide. Instead, Andy had executed a daring prison break. It turned out that 20 years ago, when Andy first used the small rock hammer to carve his name on the wall, he discovered the seemingly solid wall had become loose after years of neglect. So he asked Red to help him get posters. And every night, under cover of those small posters, Andy steadily chipped away at the wall, bit by bit. He secretly carried the debris outside through his pant legs during daily walks in the yard. Initially, Andy wasn't determined to escape. Digging was more of a pastime. After all, escaping was incredibly risky. But after learning he was truly innocent, and especially after Tommy lost his life because of him, Andy finally resolved to fight desperately for his freedom. Moreover, to uphold justice. He secretly swapped the warden's ledger on the very day he escaped, after the warden left the office. Andy took one of his suits, put on the warden's polished shoes, then calmly walked out of the prison office. Amazingly, no guards suspected anything unusual. Returning to his cell that night, Andy immediately packed his belongings. After lights out, he entered the hidden tunnel he'd spent years digging, escaped into the underground sewage system. Just then, heavy rain poured down, thunder and lightning roared. Andy used this cover to smash open the pipe leading to freedom. After crawling out, he removed his prison clothes and embraced the cleansing rain. At this moment, freedom felt like rebirth. By the time the guards discovered his absence, Andy had already completely vanished. All Shawshank's search dogs could find was a worn-out hammer and an old prison uniform. Soon after, Andy appeared at the bank, dressed neatly in a suit. He had assumed the identity of the imaginary person he'd created years before. He withdrew all the money from the account and asked the bank manager to mail some documents to the press. Quickly, Shawshank Prison's dark secrets made headlines. The warden was surrounded by investigators before he could react. He desperately tried to destroy evidence, but found only a Bible inside his safe. Opening it, he discovered a note from Andy. "You were right. The path to salvation lies within," and saw the hollow imprint of the small rock hammer. It turned out, many years ago, during the surprise inspection, the hammer guards couldn't find, had been hidden inside Andy's Bible. Seeing no escape, the warden took out his gun. At first, he planned to fight the approaching police, but after brief hesitation, he aimed the gun at himself and pulled the trigger. once calm returned. Red received a postcard. Though unsigned, he immediately knew Andy had sent it. Andy had already left America, successfully reaching his dream destination. In the days that followed, Red often thought about Andy, though occasionally saddened by his friend's departure. He understood some birds can't be caged, because their wings are too strong and shine too brightly to be restrained. Several years later, Red faced yet another parole hearing. By then, he'd spent 40 years in Shawshank. He no longer held any hope for release, so this time when questioned, instead of sincerely promising to reform as usual, he spoke honestly from his heart. "I don't know what rehabilitation really means, so stop asking if I'm remorseful. I don't know. And frankly, I doubt you care either." After this provocative speech, the parole board fell silent, but suddenly, they stamped his papers approved, all along. They had wanted genuine honesty, not meaningless words of repentance. Soon after, Red finally walked out of the institution that had confined him. Just like Brooks, he boarded a bus and moved into the same provided apartment. Even Brooks's carved message remained clearly visible on the ceiling. But Red fared slightly better than Brooks. He was younger and found work as a supermarket assistant. Yet every time he needed to use the restroom, he instinctively asked his boss for permission, leaving the manager deeply embarrassed. Red didn't intend this, but after 40 years in prison, he couldn't break this habit. Without reporting, he simply couldn't urinate. Now he truly understood Brooks' despair. He even considered buying a gun to end his life, but he didn't follow Brooks' tragic footsteps because he still hadn't fulfilled the promise he'd made to Andy after buying a compass. Red traveled alone to Buxton, following Andy's description from memory. He found the stone wall, near the big oak tree, and under a distinctive black volcanic stone, he uncovered a rusty metal box. Inside the box was cash, and a letter from Andy. The letter said, "Since you've come this far, why not go a little farther? I've set up the chessboard. I'm waiting for you." These words planted seeds of hope in Red's despairing heart. After a brief struggle, he returned to the apartment, packed his belongings, and just like Brooks, took out a knife to carve his name on the beam. Red was here too. But unlike Brooks, Red held on to hope. Purchasing a ticket, he defied his parole conditions and boarded a bus headed for Zihuatanejo. Excited beyond words, for the first time in over 40 years, he traveled freely toward an unknown future. Finally reaching the agreed meeting place by the sea, he reunited with his old friend.